Devil you know, diagnosing and detecting enteric fever. It's 10 minutes for the talk and 5 minutes for the questions. We're going to be really strict timekeepers and allow only 2 to 3 questions per presentation. So I'd like to ask those of you who want to ask questions to move rapidly to the microphones. Our first speaker, Stephane Pouzol from the Fondation Mérieux, and he's going to be talking about the evaluation of a new real-time PCR in patients with fever in Bangladesh.
Thank you. And I would thank the organization to give me the opportunity to present the result we had with our study in Bangladesh. So the main objectives of this study was to first develop a PCR test, a multiplex PCR test, to identify simultaneously typhi and paratyphi A, and also validate this assay in a clinical settings where typhoid is endemic. The evaluation of the first phase of the study was we designed a molecular multiplex assay targeting CRISPR genes to identify and serotype typhi and paratyphi A. Unfortunately, the results obtained on 1 ml of blood sample show really limited sensitivity, as we were able to identify only 45% of blood culture. So we've modified the sample prep, and by increasing the volume of blood up to 3 ml, and also by combining a culture-based method, this pre-enrichment step include the ox bile, which allows a better release of bacteria trapped in white blood cells. We also have seen that these ox bile do not impair bacteria growth in blood. Oops. So we have enrolled 45 controls and 685 cases with fever higher than 38 degrees. Then we mixed up 2 or 3 ml of blood with the same volume of TSB ox bile and grew the samples for 5 hours. The sample, in case of late collecting sample, we can mix the sample with the pre-enrichment media and store at 4 degrees overnight until processing the day after. After culture, the sample were frozen and shipped to France, where nucleic acid extraction and real-time PCR were performed. Okay. So we have identified 98 sample positive for blood culture and 527 sample negative. And among these samples, vomiting seems to be relevant in blood culture positive compared to blood culture negative samples. I will draw your attention on the volume of blood collecting for either PCR or blood culture, which is similar in both groups, and also the delay in collecting blood and the time to perform PCR or blood culture. These parameters are similar in both groups and may not explain the further result in PCR. To consider a sample as positive, two specific signals must be identified. The first one is related to typhi or paratyphi, and the second one is related to the spacing. When we have these two signals, the sample is considered, and then we analyze the data. So we have identified 73 out of 98 samples as typhi and 18 as paratyphi A. Unfortunately, we were not able to identify 7 samples in blood culture positive, and that's made due to the antibiotics impact or bacterial load. In blood culture negative, we were able to additionally identify 73 samples, and 66 were typhi and 7 paratyphi A. So when we look at the PCR assay performance, one interesting thing is the delay in minute between the blood collection and the time to process in PCR. As you can see, this time is longer in PCR positive than compared to blood culture negative. And this is interesting because a longer delay means a longer pre-incubation time with oxbile and probably a better release of the bacteria and a better growth. So this result may explain why we identify more negative, more typhi or paratyphi in negative blood culture. In parallel, the time to a blood culture turn positive is longer when the PCR is negative, and that suggests that the bacterial load, the initial bacterial load, is lower in negative PCR compared to positive PCR. So when we look at the overall performance of the assay, we have determined the sensitivity around 93% and the specificity around 80%, 90%, which is in the range. And we also observe a very good negative likelihood ratio. So as conclusion, we are able to identify 93% of the blood culture positive sample in the study. And all the sample I identify, all the species identified in blood culture match with those identified in PCR. No control sample were identified either in blood culture or PCR. And we have improved the detection in blood sample, in negative blood culture, about 74%. And one result that I've not shown, but we know that with this assay, we are able to identify as low as 1 CFU per ml in sample. So the strength of this molecular assay is that we have tested it on a relevant number of clinical specimens. And as we combine two specific detection to identify correctly a strain, the test is robust in multiplex, and thanks to that, we fine-tune the disease burden results in Dhaka. So of course, we failed to identify 7 samples, and there are no method to compare correctly the performance of our assay because the blood culture was not considered as a gold standard. Antibiotics was not assessed also during the study, and that may explain why we have missed the 7 sample, but also why so many samples remain negative after blood culture. So we still need an invasive and large collecting blood to perform this assay. And also this molecular test, of course, requests infrastructure and skilled staff. So finally, we didn't develop a diagnostic test, but it's rather surveillance test. So this test is now running in Africa in 3 countries, which are Ghana, Malawi, and Burkina Faso. The algorithm of the study is quite different because we decided to enroll patients with 3 days of consecutive fever and a fever higher than 38 degrees. We will enroll children and adults based on the same volume of blood, which are 2 ml for children and 3 ml or more for adults. So I want to thank the Gates Foundation for the funding, and thanks everybody involved in the project.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Stephane. Thank you for the presentation. To start off, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. It seemed to me that the PCR actually had a larger volume than went into the blood culture for the 730. It was 2.6 versus 3.4.
That's true.
So could that be the reason why you were picking up more PCR positives?
That's probably one of the reasons, for sure. We have seen, in the previous study, we have also evaluated 5 ml of blood. And the performance are really improved when we increase the volume of blood.
Okay. Are there any questions from the audience? If not, I'd like to invite a question from Florian if he's here in the room, because here there were 45 healthy patients who did not have a PCR positive on, blood culture negatives that were not PCR positive, whereas we had heard recently that in Africa, particularly in Ethiopia, there were people who were identified as PCR positive who were healthy. So I don't know whether that is a consistent finding in multiple locations. Have you tried doing blood culture negatives by PCR in other locations as well?
So it's ongoing in Africa, but the results are really preliminary. So we don't have evidence of that.
Okay. And it looks like Florian is not in the room, so yeah.
Yeah, so we have done a pilot study in our CETA program in which we screened 100 febrile patients and 200 controls in a couple of sites, in 6 sites in Ethiopia, 2 sites in Madagascar, and 1 site in Ghana. And we looked into the seroprevalence of VI antibodies, and also we looked into real-time PCR data from both the cases and the controls, and we found, especially in Ethiopia, quite a number of controls, healthy controls, which had a real-time PCR positive result. But that was only, I think it was 22 positives out of 1,200 healthy controls.
Okay, thank you very much. The next speaker is going to be Bumano Mark from Makerere University here in Uganda, and he will talk about the carriage of Salmonella typhi among vendors in 2 Kampala markets.
Good morning, all. Me, I'm Bumano Mark, Makerere University, College of Health Science. My research is about carriage of Salmonella typhi among vendors into Kampala markets.
Just point at that end. Point there. When you point to move your slide.
Typhoid fever is a public major health problem in sub-Saharan Africa. And typhoid fever affects nearly 27 million people and 200,000 deaths annually. Chronic carrier gallbladder carriage of Salmonella typhi is initiative and it's sporadic and it's a major typhoid outbreak. Kampala really suffered about large typhoid fever or large outbreak involving 10,230 cases during 2015, and most cases were in Nakasero market, found in near to the center of Kampala. And then we sat and then we just put our objective and to estimate the prevalence of salmonella carriage among vendors in 2 markets. Methodology, this study was a descriptive cross-sectional study in 2 markets, Nakasero and Kalero market, during July to September 2016. And even we evaluate to demographic data and hygiene practices, like the way of people drink water and the kind of hygienes, washing hands. So this, and my sample size was 778 stool sample, and it was single collected from participant. And we did culture of salmonella in District A. And then after night, and then we found is it growth or not. And then we did like isolations by using biochemical tests. Okay. Result, 7 out of 778 was Salmonella typhi positive. 7 of them was positive. And they distributed into 4 to 3, 4 from Nakasero, 4 from the Kalero market, and it was 1.1%, and 3 from Kalero, from Nakasero market is 3.7% out of 424. And even here, and this is the map of Uganda, and even this Kampala district show us two markets, Nakasero and Kalero markets, and even they show us the positive 7 sample, or the positive Salmonella typhi. Okay, they're like in the red color, those stars, like 7s. And 1 comes from outside of Kampala district. This slide showing the participant characteristics. And the study was sex, male is 354, and female was 424. Okay, and then the age was grouped into 4 groups, and even we found that the most of positive sample, the age between 24 or 25 to 40, and 41 to 59. Okay, this the age group, and even we evaluate the uses of antibiotics, and then we ask them, did you use antibiotics before or prior 2 weeks? Then people say participants say yes. It was 433. And number of positives was 2%, or 2 out of. And the type of drinking water, and then we just divide into 3, unboiled treated water, just and locally packaged like boiled water, and the last one is chemically treated water, and even like mineral water even. Then we put it into 3 groups. So unboiled water was 163 participants, and locally packaged was 146 sample, and chemical treated water. And even we find that lastly the wash hands, like hygienes, people who wash hands by their soap after using toilet, then they say yes, and people they say no, when it's clear. Table 2 is showing us antibiotic susceptibility tests. We did like 7 susceptibility patterns for those antibiotics, and ampicillin, azithromycin, ceftriaxone, chloramphenicol. All of them, or most of them, is sensitive or susceptible to these drugs. Azithromycin, ceftriaxone, Cipro, and meropenem are the susceptible, and the rest was resistance, and even it's so clear there. And there's 7 out of 7 or 0 out of 7. Even here, the conversions of susceptibility, pattern, carriage, and outbreak strain. And even we compare between the outbreak 2015 and the carrier one this time. And then we found 11 of isolates is just related to what? To the carriage isolates, but it's 6 is related. So this total of this outbreak was 49. Discussion the study demonstrate that the carriage outbreak in the market vendors the frequency is 0.9%. That is possible, and even we want to increase the susceptibility of detections. Out of outbreak strain share susceptibility pattern with the carrier strains, indicating the possible relationship between them, between those two, between the carriage and outbreak strains. However, we want to use like more discriminative molecular techniques are required to demonstrate the relatedness between them. My conclusion is some notification occur among vendors in Kampala, forming an important reservoir for transmission of and potential outbreak. Recommendations, I recommend to just health education for personnel and improve the water sources and access to potable water. And number 2, must to do molecular work or molecular study to find out or to establish the epidemiological relationship between the carriage strain. And lastly, acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge or to thank participants, market authorities for consenting the study, and even I want to thank Uganda National Health Laboratory Services and East Africa Public Health Laboratory Network Programming for sponsoring this study. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for again showing and reporting on the existence of carriers in your country. His presentation is open for discussion. Duncan, on the right.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Bumano. Duncan Steele from the Gates Foundation. I just wondered, it looked like about 60%, 433 of your vendors were using antibiotics in the last 2 weeks. Do you have any idea what antibiotics they were using and what they were using them for? Because that just seems very, very high. And I wondered if the survey was done during, for instance, winter, when people might have respiratory infections and be using antibiotics, you know, sort of ad hoc to deal with that.
Of course, we asked them to just list the antibiotic that they use prior 2 weeks. And even we mentioned like 5 antibiotics, like chloramphenicol and ceftriaxone. And so they were saying they took antibiotics prior. But we suspect people who like carry it, people who don't show any symptoms, and even no any symptom for Salmonella typhi or for typhoid fever. So this is that.
No, thank you. I'm not asking actually specifically if they took the antibiotic for typhoid fever. I just wonder if you had any collection of data as to why they took. Was it diarrhea? Was it, you know, some kind of gastro or respiratory symptom? Because that's a very high use of antibiotics, and that's probably not a good situation to be in. So, I mean, that might even open another avenue of research for you to look at, but trying to understand why they're using antibiotics.
Okay. People, they use antibiotics not for specifically for Salmonella typhi or typhoid fever. They're using for other diseases. Okay, so people even cannot show us like they have this typhoid fever, and then we just intend it, and then we find out are they people use these antibiotics or they not use, and even they have another diseases, and even we ask them, do you have any symptoms showing any signs, then like diarrhea, fever, like.
It might be an important issue to address in a future study.
Just, I happen to lead that investigation that Stephane is going to present. So this is really an aftermath of that outbreak investigation, big outbreak in Kampala. So what happened is that there was a big outbreak, so there's a lot of media publicity. So I suspect the high antibiotic use was because people were aware of this outbreak. They would start to take antibiotics from the over-the-counter shops.
Yeah, of course. 2015, it was like a big problem for Ugandan Ministry of Health, and even the authorities of like city authorities, KCCA, and then they recruit many physicians and even lab technicians and even WHO to just to face this like serious problem. And right now, people, they just took antibiotics and then to cure, and even they just got scared about those diseases. And people right now, they just boil water for preventing themselves from those typhoid fever.
Okay, thank you. I'm still a bit troubled, but it may be due to my own ignorance in the issue when we talk about carriership. how about the dynamics? And it's maybe a question for the audience as well. How about the dynamics of carriership? Do we have continuous spreading of Salmonellas in these cases, or intermediate carriership or sporadic carrierships? Do we know anything about different clades or species? Do people carry once a particular strain or a different strain? Is there any work being done in that respect? There are many, many questions around carriership and its impact in relationship to outbreaks, of course. I think we don't have time to discuss all these issues, but it may be worth spending some time on it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We move to the next presentation, and that's by Stephen Kabwama on behalf of David Ogutu, who could not be here, and it takes the story of typhoid in Kampala further.
Okay, so like they have said, I'm going to present on behalf of David Ogutu, who couldn't be here. So, on the 6th of February 2015, the Ministry of Health received reports about a man who had died on the 5th. He had been hospitalized on the 2nd, and he had complained of severe abdominal pain, prolonged fever, and jaundice. So on the 10th of February, we started our investigation. So we investigated to identify the nature of this illness, establish the mode of transmission and risk factors, and come up with evidence-based control measures. So we started by going to the hospital where this man had passed away. We interviewed the clinician who had attended to him. He informed us that he had complained of severe abdominal pain, and they had tested him with a screening test, the withheld test, and it was positive. While we were there, we also asked him whether there were other people in the health center who had similar symptoms. There was a lady. She also said that her colleagues were sick, and her husband also had similar symptoms but had taken antibiotics and gotten better. We also went to the communities where this lady worked, and we interviewed people there, and we could see there were people who had similar symptoms. So we developed a case definition. Our suspected case was onset of fever for at least 3 days since 1st January 2015 with headache, abdominal pain, a negative malaria test, or failure to respond to anti-malaria treatment, and at least 2 of the following symptoms: diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, constipation, or fatigue in a resident of Kampala or neighboring districts. A probable case was a suspected case who had a positive Tubex test. A confirmed case was a suspected case that had that yielded some Salmonella typhi by blood culture. So we found cases by going to the markets and the taxi park where these the initial cases were reported. Also, together with the Kampala Capital City Authority, there were treatment centers that were set up all over the city for people to go and seek medical care. Also, leaders went to like radios and encouraged people to go and seek medical attention. So by the end of the outbreak, there had been 10,230 suspected cases. 1,038 of these were positive by Tubex, and there were 56 confirmed cases. The attack rates, males had a slightly higher attack rate compared to females, and persons aged 15 to 59 years had an attack rate much higher than the older and younger age groups. This spot map shows the distribution of suspected case patients They were mostly in the Kawempe, Rubaga, and Makinde divisions, but they were distributed all over Kampala. This epi curve, it shows suspected case patients. As you can see, they go as far back. We started our investigation around 10th February, but the dates of onset go as far back as January, meaning that this outbreak could have started much earlier. So we tried to hypothesize whether this was either foodborne or waterborne. First, the case distribution all over Kampala was compatible with the waterborne source. Then also when we interviewed some of the case patients, they reported drinking water that was at unreasonably low price, something that is supposed to cost, for example, $0.6, costing about $0.1. Then we interviewed the patients, case patients, and some of them said that they reported getting their drinking water from their workplace. They did not come with water from home. So we strongly suspected that this was a waterborne outbreak. So we did a case control study where we enrolled 33 case patients and frequency matched them to 78 controls by gender and place of work. Then we interviewed them about their usual sources of water and food. Persons who took Kavera water, this is water packed in a plastic bag, were 9 times more likely to have the illness. Persons who consumed Butunda, which is passion fruit juice, were almost 5 times more likely to be sick. Bottled water and food items were not associated with the disease. So the Kavera water I was talking about was that this picture on your left top corner. Butunda is on the right top corner. Obushera, it was there, but it wasn't statistically significant. And then Munanasi, which is passion fruit juice, it is packed like that. So as part of generating our evidence, we compared cases and controls who did not consume any of the drinks to those who consumed either 1, 2, 3 or more drinks. And we found that persons who consumed more drinks were more likely to get sick depending on the number of drinks you consumed. And the chi-square test for linear trend was statistically significant. So in picture number 1, you can see the underground water sources. In picture number 2, you can actually see someone collecting water from there. Picture 3, someone actually consuming that water. And in picture 4, I just want to draw your attention to the containers that were being used to collect this water. And here you see someone actually making butunda, which is passion fruit juice, to make the water. I mean, using that water to make the passion fruit juice. So in the lab investigation, 56 blood samples that were collected yielded Salmonella typhi by blood culture. There are around 360 blood samples that were collected, and 56 of these were positive. And also juice samples were collected, juice and water samples were collected, and they were heavily contaminated with fecal matter. So we concluded that this was a large outbreak of typhoid fever and was caused by consuming locally made drinks that were made with contaminated underground water. So at the end of our investigation, we made several recommendations, and some of them were implemented. There was provision of safe water by the National Water and Sewerage Corporation. Some partners, like UNICEF, provided free water chlorination products. Kampala Capital City Authority closed off some of those underground water sources. And also some leaders went to media and told people to boil their water and avoid drinking unclean water and juice from the markets. You can see a steady decline in the case count after these interventions were put in place. I'd like to acknowledge the following institutions that that contributed to this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Questions? Duncan?
Thanks for that presentation. I just wonder what the impact was. Obviously, you must have had a lot of vendors in the markets that were selling these homemade drinks, whether they're packaging the water or making the batenda or whatever. Was there any assessment of what the impact was on them from a market point of view once the recommendation was not to drink that any longer?
Unfortunately, we didn't ask. I think you're asking about maybe their livelihoods from getting money from these kind of things, but we did not actually assess. I think the main activity was to contain the outbreak and control it as soon as possible. So we didn't go ahead to assess the impact in terms of how this could affect their livelihoods. But I think it's a good concern. It probably affected some people's livelihoods.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Tony. I work with Uganda Youth Alliance for Family Planning. I'm from also Uganda, the Pearl of Africa. Yes. My question is about, because I've gone through that report, and one of the interventions that WHO took over was, first of all, to tell people to have those vaccines, to have vaccines when they're traveling to Uganda. But my concern is, when you look at the underground contaminated water, did you do some research about the boreholes? Because when you go into communities, people have, they have that waters from the boreholes and wells and springs, it doesn't have any effect if someone drinks it. So did you have any research on boreholes? Because people believe in Africa that it's water someone can drink, and to me, I think something has to be investigated about it. Thank you.
Yeah, true. I think in Kampala being an urban setting, there's a lot of contamination that can occur. There needs to be an improvement in the sanitation systems so that sewage and other contaminants don't contaminate the underground water. But also, it has been documented that there is a perception that this underground water is safe, and that's why some people take it. So, and like I showed, there were some underground water sources that were tested, and they were found to be heavily contaminated with fecal matter.
Thank you. Dr. Maswinda from the city of Harare in Zimbabwe. I would like to ask two questions. The first one is, after the public health interventions, has the use of this water changed now in those markets? That's the first one. And the second one, I was interested in your results of the Chubex and the blood culture. How many of the blood culture results also had Chubex, and what was the sensitivity and specificity of those tests? Thank you.
Okay, let me start with the second question. For the Chubex, around 3,500, about 10% of the suspected case patients underwent Chubex testing. And that's 10% of the total suspected case patients. That's a positivity rate of about 29%. For the blood culture, every day the 5 suspected case patients from the treatment centers, their blood samples would be taken for testing. And there were 364 that were tested, and 56 of these were positive. That's a positivity rate of about 15%. The second question was whether people continued to sell these things after the outbreak. There remains a gap in the implementation and also putting in place these long-term interventions, such as improvement in the sanitation and waste treatment. But I think that after some time, of course, some people continue to sell them, but we can comfortably say that the outbreak was contained at the end of the
Zulfi, last
investigation.
question.
So I'll be very quick. So you seem to have gone into this investigation with a very strong suspicion that it was the water and the drinks. How much in-depth assessment did you do on food consumption, street foods or whatever was available in that environment?
Yeah, this is, we also investigated some other variables that we thought would be associated with the illness. For example, where they got their lunch food, where they got their breakfast food, and as you can see, they were not associated with this illness. When we were interviewing, it wasn't only water, but also food, but the only significant associations with the illness were the street vended beverages.
Just a comment for those interested in the environmental microbiology part of this investigation. There is a poster, number 54, upstairs that presents a little more detail. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to the next presentation.
So the next presenter will be John Lusingu. John is from the National Institute of Medical Research in Tanzania, and the title of his presentation is Salmonella typhi bloodstream infections among infants and children in Korogwe District Hospital in Tanzania.
Thank you. Good morning. I've been working quite a lot in malaria vaccine, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And this was an incidental finding that we found there is a lot of invasive Salmonella typhi in Korogwe, Tanzania, as what we heard this morning from Carl's presentation. But also John Crump did some studies in Tanzania in a nearby site whereby they were looking into non-malaria fevers. So I'll go through the background, the methods, and then age-specific Salmonella typhi, and then susceptibility pattern to antimicrobial, and the summary and discussion. So fever in Tanzania is commonly diagnosed as malaria because it's the leading cause of fever in Tanzania. But over years, malaria has been declining, and so other causes of fever might be like viral and also bacterial causes. And if you're not managed very well, the bacteremia can lead to septicemia and then also death. So unfortunately, there are limited facilities for performing microbiology tests, especially in remote areas, rural setup, like where I'm going to present about Korogwe. And during the process of implementing phase 3 malaria vaccine trial, clinical and laboratory facilities were improved along the 11 sites in Africa where phase 3 malaria vaccine trial was conducted. We started improving our microbiology lab in the year 2008, and we implemented phase 3 malaria vaccine trial in 2010, February. So the main target was to evaluate children who were admitted with a history of fever in the past 24 hours, and also temperature, auxiliary temperature above or equal to 37.5 degrees Celsius. And we did the blood culture, and it was to establish the causes beyond malaria, what other causes may lead to these febrile episodes. And Korogwe is located in Tanzania and is close to Indian Ocean, 100 kilometers from the Indian Ocean, and it also is 4.5 hours drive from Mount Kilimanjaro, not at the top, but at the foot of Mount Kilimanjaro, and is south of Kenya and also nearby Uganda on the south side. So we collected venous blood in a septic technique, and we incubated in the blood culture bottles in Bactec 950, as you have seen this picture here. And the basic media were used to culture alcohols from positive culture bottles, and the antimicrobial susceptibility testing was done using the disk diffusion technique. We also participated in internal quality control, and for the external quality assurance, we were being monitored by CLS South Africa. And the idea was to make sure that when we started in 2008, to make sure that contamination rate is below 10%, but by the end, it was, after 1 year, it was below 5%. So the types of isolates that we isolated, the bacterial infection, the most leading was Salmonella typhi, as you can see in this graph here, the topmost bar, and then the others were following, and then non-typhoid Salmonella were also present, but in lower prevalence compared to Salmonella typhi. So when we looked into age group, how many were present in different age groups, we find that majority of them were below 2 years. John Crump this morning was talking about data that are needed from those who are below 2 years. And this is one of the unpublished data. We are still working on them. Then when you look into age-specific Salmonella typhi, you find that majority of them were below 42 months. And then you look, they were much more concentrated below 24 months, as you have seen in this graph here, the frequency. Looking into susceptibility tests, we find that multi-drug resistance was very common. If you look to the conventional antibiotics that are being used, the resistance was very high, around 80 to 90%. But also there was emerging antibiotic resistance to the fluoroquinones and the third generation cephalosporins. So in summary, we have isolated Salmonella typhi, which was predominant among under 5s in Korogwe. As you have seen from Carl's presentation this morning, majority of the sites in sub-Saharan Africa, among 11 sites, non-typhoid Salmonella was much more predominant compared to Salmonella typhi, except in Korogwe. And the majority of the Salmonella typhi, around 64%, were among those who were below 2 years. And the multiple drug resistance was very common, and the resistance to the ciprofloxacin and the ceftriaxone is also emerging in this site. So it underscores the need for similar studies to be conducted in rural settings. To begin with, I didn't say this is a stable population. We are doing demographic surveillance in this site, and most of the people here, they are just inhabitants in the rural settings. The mobility pattern is very, very limited. It's not too much like in semi-urban or urban setups. But also the issue, there is the issue of typhoid conjugate vaccine, TIVAC. We heard about invitation tomorrow. But I also encourage that this TIVAC vaccine, typhoid conjugate vaccine, could be tested more across different settings in sub-Saharan Africa. I talk about this because I have experience with the RTSS malaria vaccine trial that was tested in different settings with a different malaria transmission intensity. So it's very important that this vaccine could also be tested in different settings in Africa. So I would like to acknowledge the study participants, the research team, GSK, who established the Good Microbial Laboratory in Korogwe, Path Malaria Vaccine Initiatives, collaborating institutions from London School of Hygiene Tropical Medicine, CMP, Denmark, and London and KCMC in Tanzania, the Salmonella Auxiliary Study, which I participated in the meeting in September, which Carl was referring this morning, and also Coalition Against Typhoid, which invited me to present, to share with you these data, and also World Health Organization. Asanteni sana, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing these wonderful data. Very important data, I think, in particular for the under 2, there where we often lack this type of information. His presentation is open for discussion on the right.
Hi, Melita Gordon from Malawi. Wonderful, thank you very much. Just kind of a couple of comments to see if you have anything to add. The first is just to highlight that in Malawi we have similarly seen a really quite a significant number of cases below the age of 1 and even down to below 6 months, which I think echoes the findings that you've had in the very young children. And second, just again to comment that I think you're right to raise the issue about rural disease rather than urban disease. Certainly, although we have seen most typhoid in Blantyre City, we are very aware from our strata study that there's a lot of migration to and fro, particularly at this time of year when we're harvesting in Malawi. And I think this is a very real thing, that the mobility of typhoid between more rural settings and urban is maybe not as concrete as it might appear. I don't know if you have any comments to make on that.
Thank you for the comments. But just to give you some information, in Tanzania, most of the typhoid cases have been detected in the central part of Tanzania, especially in a region known as Morogoro and also in Dar es Salaam. But also John Cramp, in their study, they also detected cases of typhoid fever in Mosh, which is somehow semi-urban and urban settings. But in our case, I stated clearly that this is a rural setup, whereby typhoid was not commonly identified previously, and also we don't know whether it's an epidemic or it's not an epidemic.
Other questions? Yes, here.
Sorry. So in typhoid in the very young kids, have we looked in the mothers to see whether they may also be infected or carriers? Or do we think this is all from environmental transmissions to the very young?
Right. We have not investigated into the risk factors of the typhoid in these children. We were doing just the study within the inpatient participants. We did not go into the community, so we have not established the environmental causes, and also we have not investigated their mothers. We are planning to do a follow-on study in the same setting that we are going to incorporate all those issues that you are raising.
There's another thing that strikes me if I take the presentation of Cal together with your information is when we look at the non-typhoid Salmonella versus Salmonella typhi, the extreme variation between the sites in isolation rates that goes from, let's say, 10-20% up to 80% or more. Do you have any idea of why?
I don't have any idea as to why that variation occurs. So maybe when we investigate further and look into the risk factors, for instance, now the samples have been, they are being analyzed with the whole genome sequencing, and probably thereafter we will have some explanations.
Any comments from your side, Cal?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of difference going on generally in Africa. So on the whole, NTS, I think we're dealing with an endemic disease burden that's really been overlooked largely by the global health community. Typhoid seems to come in, I mean, there's sort of low levels, and then we seem to get these outbreaks. It'd be very interesting to know with John's site in Tanzania what the what's happening long term. Certainly in Malawi, when I was working there previously, very little typhoid, and then we suddenly had this outbreak. So I think what we've got in this sort of area of Africa is fragile systems which are really at high risk of similar things happening. There might just be small levels, but then there can be high outbreaks coming, which is a good case for vaccination. But on the other hand, with non-typhoidal salmonella, you've got strong associations with malaria, HIV, malnutrition, and that's giving a constant endemic disease burden.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll move on to the next speaker.
The next speaker is Jillian Gauld from the Institute for Disease Modeling, and this is a different approach to typhoid fever.
Hi there. I am presenting today on typhoid fever in a historical site. We've been working on mathematical modeling of this disease, and I'll be talking about some of the perspectives from looking backwards. Is it echo down? Great. So just to give you an outline of the talk, I'm going to be giving you an overview of the Santiago context for those who are not familiar. I'm talking about the modeling project and our goals in general, the process of model fitting, as well as takeaways for both within Santiago and application to new locations. So Santiago, Chile is a place where there really isn't typhoid today. In the 1970s and 80s, though, there was high endemic transmission, so over 100 per 100,000 cases per year reported. And this was really interesting because there was over 90% clean drinking water in this location, as well as about 80% of households were connected to the sewage system. So it was really, at the time, kind of strange as far as why is there this high level of typhoid. And it came out later that, and it was discovered in the 80s, that this was due mostly to the irrigation of agricultural crops with the sewage water. So essentially, although there was 80% sewage coverage, the sewage wasn't treated before it sort of flowed down the river. There was a decline in the 1980s coincident with Ty21A vaccine trial in the area, as well as carrier finding and treatment. But really, typhoid didn't completely drop off in Santiago until the first few cases of cholera occurred in the city in 1991. And even though throughout the early 80s, it was known that, that irrigation of crops with sewage water was this main transmission, until cholera appeared on the scene, no real plans were made to get rid of it. And so once the 1991 ban on irrigation with wastewater was put in place, you can see a really sharp decline in typhoid. Oops. Oh yes, and so this is kind of a newspaper article in the area when cholera popped up. So why are we looking sort of into the past to model typhoid? And there's a few different reasons. So the first is that there's essentially within one single site, we have 3 different transmission periods. So we have this high endemic transmission, the time when there was control either through awareness of the transmission route or the vaccine trial that occurred. And this happened within a single population and demographic set. And in addition, that cholera intervention was extremely immediate. So we really knew that after this cholera intervention happened, we know that most of that transmission would have had to be from sort of more direct transmission. And we also have data that's not commonly available in most sites today. So the age distribution of typhoid and seasonality are things that are often collected through passive surveillance. But we also have information. We know the transmission route. There are studies on carrier prevalence, as well as the time that I mentioned with only this sort of short cycle transmission. And this allows us to basically explore the underlying mechanisms for these dynamics and also understand in an area where we probably know much more than what we'll know in locations modeling today, what the areas of uncertainty are. So just to give you a quick overview of the modeling approach, we have an individual-based model that basically allows for individual level variation in parameters. So we use historical data on shedding duration, as well as carrier probabilities, and also can track individuals' previous numbers of infections in the population if immunity plays a large role. Infections can either be acute or subclinical, so there is a lot of sort of background transmission, acknowledging that there's a lot of background transmission that isn't picked up through regular surveillance. There's also a permanent chronic carrier state, as well as this sort of immunity or protection per infection parameter. When we look at modeling transmission routes, I think from a modeler's perspective, often our first jump is to talking about transmission in terms of environmental transmission and direct transmission. But I think it is a lot more complex with typhoid. And I know, so Ginny Pitzer's model originally coined sort of these terms in the context of typhoid. And they're really useful because it clarifies exactly what is going on with the transmission route. So when we think about long cycle transmission, it could be as simple as exposure to the environment, but there's also the potential, as we've seen in Santiago, that the environment can infect produce. And so that ends up being an environmental mediated transmission route, but it's not necessarily due to direct contact with the transmission, with the environment. As well, there's this sort of short cycle transmission, which can be anything from some type of human contamination. So we don't necessarily know how much typhoid is transmitted from direct contact, but certainly through sort of food vehicles in the home or through food handlers. So just to give you an idea of the model fitting process, we have historical data on the age distribution, incidence, carrier prevalence, and seasonality for typhoid. And we have parameters that we fit to the data. So just on the left is showing kind of what the model output looks like for the age distribution of typhoid when you haven't necessarily fitted, for example, the immunity in the population. And once you run the model over many iterations, it hones in on kind of the best fit. And just to clarify, this provides sort of a point estimate for fitted parameters, but I'll discuss a little bit later the uncertainty around some of these. So some of the takeaways from our model fitting process, if you see on the right, this is the age-specific incidence for typhoid in Santiago, Chile, in the pre-vaccine era. And one of the interesting things that we see in this age distribution, and also in many age distributions when we look in current typhoid endemic areas, is that there's very few cases in adults and individuals really past the age of 30. And modeling this it's really difficult to capture that. And so there's kind of two main mechanisms that can control that adult age distribution and that drop-off. Just showing you so this is kind of a model with baseline assumptions that say there is no immunity or no protection in adults. And what you see is kind of this flattened age distribution. And essentially, when you assume that there's either sort of this low protection per infection or a high immunity, you can really fit the dynamics of the data better. There's a trade-off between the immunity or protection after infection and the total cases in the population. And so, as I mentioned, we account for both clinical and subclinical cases. So our estimates show that a maximum of about 6% of the total cases, including clinical and subclinical, are reported in this study. Another interesting phenomenon for the typhoid modeling is kind of what drives that early age distribution. Why are kids not necessarily always being infected at the earliest age that they're exposed? And so looking in one of the neighborhoods in Area Norte in Santiago, you could see we have these under 20 age distributions with the stepwise increases according to, and what's interesting about it is that you see correlates with introductions into the school age and preschool age individuals. And so when you fit this model, you can actually end up potentially seeing that exposure may drive that early age. We also estimate the probability of becoming a chronic carrier from infection. And just really quickly, we can use the age and gender distribution of gallstones as well as the probability of becoming a carrier. And what's interesting is some of our model results actually on the table on the bottom left show that the cases resulting in carriers end up looking really similar to estimates from the AIMS study in 1943. We also are interested in the impact of carriers in Santiago, and I'll just quickly go through this. Because we have that environmental intervention where it's mostly short cycle transmission, it really allows us to estimate what the actual infectiousness of chronic carriers is in this site in relation to general acute transmission, which was really interesting. So I will say that there are multiple fits to the Santiago data that are possible within the parameter uncertainty. So essentially this is acknowledging that our assumptions are not necessarily the answer, but that we need to look at across the range of unknowns that we have. So for example, we have daily exposure rate to the population, which assumes that approximately 50% of the population is exposed on a daily basis. We can also fit the dynamics very well when we assume only 0.5% of the population is exposed daily, and this has implications for things like wash strategies. And so we're developing methods currently on being able to quantify these unknowns across different parameter unknowns and get better bounds on wash and vaccine interventions in current studies. And I'm out of time.
Thank you very much, Jillian. This paper is now open for discussion. So I noticed that you have there the question of what happens when Salmonella is in the environment. Right? So are you looking at different kinds of environment? Would Salmonella do better in water than in food or in sewage?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I think so. Unfortunately, we don't have a huge amount of data on how Salmonella survives in sewage versus water. But what we do have is essentially, because we have our dose response in the model, when we assume that, for example, the transmission is through a generalized water source, we would assume that all of the population is being exposed probably at a lot higher rate than if it was something like food-based or through the sewage, where maybe less individuals are actually becoming exposed to the population. So I think these types of things will really help us, and hopefully environmental studies will also help inform.
Thank you very much for really very stimulating presentation. So I don't really know about Santiago, Chile, but in many parts of the, I visited there for just a week. But in many parts of the world, surveillance is a big issue. So, you know, how is diagnostics made, and how confident are you in the surveillance system?
That's another really great question. I think we make some big assumptions with the age-specific exposure, and assuming that the reported cases in Santiago for the children under 20 years of age are sampled and picked up in the same way that they might necessarily in adults. The good thing about a lot of the model fitting is that the underlying dynamics don't typically change if you, as long as you're sort of assuming that the reporting rate is a certain amount. And so I think the real important questions, I think, for us are if there's differential sensitivity and surveillance by age specifically, because I think that'll impact vaccine estimates particularly.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Just a quick comment that we have done a study on the genetic study on the survival of typhi in water.
Yeah.
It turns out that one of the main genes involved in typhi survival in water is a gene within the VI locus. Mm-hmm. But it is not the VI capsule itself, it's an enzyme within locus which sort of links VI production to survival in water, which is actually quite interesting that the two are linked genetically.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great.
Right. Thank you very much, Jillian. And we'll move on to the final presentation.
The last presentation in this morning session will be by Andrew Pollard from Oxford as well. And the title of his presentation will be Salmonella typhi bactericidal antibody activity is a correlate for disease severity, but not for protection against typhoid fever.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Denise Garrett and her team for bringing us all together for this meeting. It's quite tough working in typhoid when you live in England, and I just so that you all know, for those who don't know, England is a part of a small island which is soon to be just off the coast of Europe. So the reason why it's tough working in typhoid is that at the moment we don't have any. There were some large outbreaks in the 1800s in Oxford, but we don't have any at the moment. So our way around that has been to deliberately infect volunteers with Salmonella typhi so that we can study the disease and test vaccines. And you heard some examples of that from Tom a few moments ago. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about trying to understand some aspects of immunity related to the live oral vaccines. So this is the setup of the challenge model that I'm going to talk about. So on the left there, you can see that we had 3 different groups. So the individuals were randomized to either receive a placebo, which was just bicarbonate, or they received an experimental vaccine called ZH9, which is an attenuated strain of Salmonella typhi, and you can see on the slide, or you probably can't read it, but you can see on the slide the mutations. I won't go into any details on that. That vaccine was given orally as a single dose. And then the third group is a group who received TY21A, the licensed vaccine, which is licensed in Europe as a 3-dose vaccine. And so the individuals had 3 doses orally of that vaccine. And then you can see that there's a 28-day period where nothing happens, and then they're challenged by drinking orally 10 to the 4 colony-forming units of Salmonella typhi, and that's day 0, and the strain used is the quail strain. And then we watch the volunteers for the next 2 weeks to see if any of them develop typhoid. And some of them do develop typhoid, as you can see there. That's the group called TD at the bottom, and some don't develop typhoid. So if we were to now look at what happened during the course of that study, you can see there in red in the placebo group, around about 2/3 of the individuals develop typhoid. So that's our background rate of typhoid with this dose of oral challenge. The blue line there is ZH9, the single dose typhoid vaccine, and here after challenge, the vaccine effectiveness is only 13%, with wide confidence intervals, and essentially these individuals are not protected. The attack rate there is 58%. And then the green line there at the bottom is individuals who are vaccinated with TY21A, and you can see here now we've got 39% attack rate and a vaccine effectiveness of about 35%. So that's the setup of the model. Now, we looked at using a bactericidal assay at the functional antibody induced by those 2 different vaccines. And I don't have time to go into the details of the bactericidal assay, but essentially it works by mixing the sera from the individuals with Salmonella typhi and adding an exogenous complement source. And the method is adapted from a method that Peter Hart used in previous studies, mostly looking at murine Salmonella infections. So first of all, if we just look at the antibody levels, this is just a ELISA antibody. You can see on the left panel that when we look at LPS IgG, there's a strong response in the ZH9 group, obviously no response in the placebo group, but then a very mild rise in the TY21A group. And this had been observed in field studies with the ZH9 vaccine, that it was very immunogenic and was one of the reasons why it was being tested in our model to look at whether it should be further developed. So if we now look at bactericidal antibodies, you can see that those high levels of antibody that we saw induced with ZH9 are bactericidal. So this is just looking at the change from baseline, which is day minus 28, to day 0. And in the ZH9 group, which are the gold-coloured spots, you can see there's a rise in bactericidal antibody following immunisation. Now, if you then look at what happens after those individuals were challenged, you see an interesting pattern. So people who were in the placebo group who were challenged develop quite a large rise in bactericidal antibodies if they develop disease. So those people who didn't develop disease in the challenge group don't see a rise in antibody. Then in the middle panel, there's a bit of a rise in bactericidal antibodies in the TY21A group, but it's not as marked as in the placebo group. And finally, in the ZH9 group, who had already had a rise after vaccination, once they're challenged, there isn't much of an increase in bactericidal antibodies. These antibodies persist more strongly in the placebo group than in the TY21A or ZH9 group. But you can see they persist above baseline after vaccination and then challenge. So I think the key point of this talk is actually that this bactericidal antibody in the context of the challenge model doesn't protect against typhoid infection. So we can see a rise in LPS antibody. We can see a rise in bactericidal antibody, which obviously at this stage could be from a various different antigens. But we don't see in the challenge model any evidence of protection. And you can see there in both the TY21A group and the ZH9 group that there's no substantial difference in the antibody in protection. Interestingly, when you look at disease severity, those bactericidal antibodies do correlate with a reduction in disease severity. So with the top graphs, you can see that the incubation period is prolonged in those who had bactericidal antibodies. The number of bacteria we detected in the blood when they developed typhoid was lower, and the symptoms were less severe in those who had bactericidal antibody. And that all correlates also with reductions in cytokine production during acute infection, providing some additional support for the reduction in disease severity. When you look at correlations between LPS antibody and bactericidal antibody, there's a correlation between the two. And then with experiments to deplete the LPS antibody, you can see that the majority of the bactericidal antibody is directed at LPS. You can see once with the red arrows there, when the antibody has been depleted, the LPS antibody is depleted, there's a reduction in bactericidal antibody, showing that what we measure as being bactericidal is largely directed at LPS. So using the challenge model, bactericidal antibodies don't protect against typhoid, but they do seem to reduce disease severity. And most of those bactericidal antibodies, after the live oral vaccines, are directed at LPS. Of course, this is in the context of a challenge model, which is a pretty stringent model where we give a very high dose of bacteria and we follow our individuals extremely closely. And of course, we don't know how this relates to bactericidal antibodies in the field. And secondly, and I think important for what's happening at the moment in development of vaccines using LPS as conjugates for paratyphoid, we don't know whether this translates into the same issue with paratyphoid infection, but we have some preliminary data which suggests that the situation may be different, and hopefully we'll have more information on that before too long. I'd just like to end by acknowledging the people who actually did all the work, particularly Helena Joel, who's the large person there, who coordinated these experiments, and Helena and Lizzie, who's in the audience, who did many of the assays, and to the Wellcome Trust for funding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. There's a question over there.
Hi, I'm Shejuti from CHRF Bangladesh. You challenged the human models with 10 to the 4 CFU, and you did mention at the end that that's a really high dose.
Well, we don't know whether it's a high dose.
Okay.
We assume it is. We don't know what dose there is in the field, but yes.
Right. So, I'm just wondering, have you ever looked at different dose and antibody elicitation in relation to the dose? Because in my mind, there's always a dose effect.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you can see the dose effect to some extent anyway in the model. So we have looked at one lower dose at 10 to the 3, and I'm sure there is some relationship between the dose, but we don't have a full range of doses of bacteria to look at. I think the other thing, as Tom mentioned in his presentation, that we do treat people very early, and it may be that you get much stronger responses if they were allowed to suffer for longer.
Robert over there, and then Mike over left.
Rob Heidemann from UCL. Andy, when you use the term severity, do you really mean bloodstream invasion? And I mean, presumably this is reducing the bacterial load in the blood, which then relates to all the other symptoms, but may not necessarily relate to what's happening in the gut. So, for example, the risk of perforation or other complications.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, because we don't see any relationship between antibody and protection, then I think that's true, that we're seeing a reduction in severity of symptoms when they develop typhoid, but not a reduction in invasion because there's no relationship with protection.
Andy, when you analyze the data using as an endpoint of disease, clinical illness, plus positive blood culture, then TY21A in the challenge model showed about 80% efficacy. And that would be kind of the way one would be evaluating a vaccine in the field. A large number of people vaccinated with vaccine or placebo, only sick ones would seek care, and then you culture. Did you analyze if there was any protective role of the bactericidal antibody with that readout?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, obviously the model is a relatively artificial situation, and as Mike says, if you choose different endpoints for the model rather than our composite endpoint of either a positive blood culture or a fever for 12 hours, then those are the efficacy results you get. We haven't done this analysis separating those out in the way you suggest. It would be interesting to do that.
No more questions? Maybe from my side one. With these markers, if it's a marker of disease severity, would they be helpful for patient management? For example, identifying patients with that are associated with a worse prognosis or with severe complications, would it help us in patient management?
Well, I hope that with the arrival of VI conjugate vaccines that we'll control typhoid and this won't be such an issue. I mean, I'm not sure that this is necessarily the right way to go, but it's certainly a possibility that if you had an LPS typhoid vaccine, that you might then induce reduction in severity of disease. So I guess it's possible, but I don't know.
Okay, I think we're coming at the end of the first morning session. Without further ado, I think I would like to thank all the speakers for keeping in time and for their presentations. I'd like to thank the audience for their active participations. I'd like to thank my co-moderator. We were a great team together this morning. I think we'll reconvene at 12:30. 1:30. At 1:30, apologies. We started 10 minutes late. I think we ended 5 minutes late, so we did a very good job. Thank you very much.